Hey guys, tonight I've got creepy Reddit stories that'll make you question what's lurking in the dark. Some stories stick with you, and this one might be impossible to forget, so let's get into it. My husband came back from the war, and now he doesn't recognize me. My husband went overseas as part of the military for a few years. The entire time I anxiously awaited his return. I constantly wondered if I would ever get a phone call notifying me that he would never come home. It was strange being alone in this big house for so long, but I got by. As the end of his tour neared, my days were consumed with preparation. Everything had to be in perfect order for him. It had to be just right. In an unexpected twist of fate, I did get a call a week before he was scheduled to return. My husband wasn't dead, but he was very badly hurt. I didn't want the gruesome details, but he lost his legs and suffered a bad head injury. They told me to expect changes in his memory and behavior when he came back. They explained that recovery was a long road, that he'd need a lot of support from me, and a lot of other stuff I'm sure they've told to countless spouses waiting back at home. Even knowing all this, nothing could prepare me for what was coming. By the time I was finally going to be able to see him, I had practically picked my fingers raw from anxiety. He had to be medically stable enough to ship back, so I wasn't expecting the worst, but I clearly wasn't expecting the best either. I was scheduled to meet him at a doctor's appointment so they could go over all the details with me. I have never been fond of hospitals or doctors or anything like that, so this certainly wasn't how I wanted to see my husband for the first time. My anxiety was debilitating, but I knew he needed me, so I swallowed my apprehensions and urged myself through the doors. I signed in and the doctor met me in the office soon after. He gave me essentially the same basic rundown I'd heard before. I would notice deviations in my husband's personality. He'd probably forget some things. He had made a lot of progress, but there was still a long ways to go in terms of both physical and mental recovery. I tried to pay attention, but I was so nervous to see him that his words all seemed to blur together. The doctor stopped abruptly to knock on one of the doors, stretched along the hallway. "Mr. Hart, I have your wife here. I'm sure you're very excited to see her." He flashed me a big smile before opening the door and ushering me into the room. He looked just like I remembered, just like all the big glossy pictures that lined the hallways of the house, with the exception of his lower half. He sat in a wheelchair now, and both legs had been amputated above the knee. Their ends were concealed by tight bandages. The wounds are pretty healed up now. The bandages are just to keep the swelling down, in preparation for future prosthetic fitting. The doctor reassured me. My husband looked up at me, disoriented and confused. His expression rapidly morphed into a look of rage. "That's not my effing wife," he said, glaring up at me. My heart seized in my chest. "Honey," I started to say. The doctor cut me off. "Ryan, this is your wife. She provided ID at the front desk. Just look at her. You know this is your wife. You just showed me a picture of you two 20 minutes ago." He turned to me, a sorry expression on his face. I heard he had trouble telling the nurses apart in rehab, and he still gets confused sometimes. This is actually pretty normal. It'll get better as you talk to him. Remind him of all the memories you shared before all of this happened. My husband still looked a little skeptical, but I could tell he was at least somewhat aware of how his brain injury had affected him. He knew he wasn't all there anymore. The doctor educated me on how I could care for my husband and make sure he was safe around the house. There was a lot to remember, but I took careful notes. Finally, I was allowed to take him home. I sheepishly gripped the handles of his wheelchair and pushed him out of the office. I helped him transfer into the passenger side of my car before getting into the driver's side. "I missed you," I finally cautioned after several heavy minutes of silence. "Yeah, I missed you too," he replied, looking at me with a glimmer of recognition. I eased up a bit in my seat, hardly realizing I had been tensing my entire body. I hit the brakes a bit too hard as we approached a red light. We both lurched forward in our seats, straining against the seatbelts. "Sorry, babe," I offered meekly. "Brakes are a little touchy." "You've had this car for years," he shot back, turning to look out the window. "I know, just haven't been driving much lately," I returned with a sigh. I knew it was going to be difficult to get him to trust me. It's only gotten worse in the weeks since he's been back. The doctor has been no help. Every time I call, he writes my husband's erratic behavior off as a normal reaction to traumatic brain injury and probably PTSD. There are moments when he responds to logic, admitting that I must be his wife because I look exactly like he remembers. We flip through photo albums together each day and laugh over our shared memories. I fill in the gaps when he's forgotten something. We hold hands, and sometimes he even initiates a kiss. If I happen to forget the smallest detail he remembers, or thinks he remembers, really, a switch flips and I know the chance for reasoning with him is gone. He can't seem to accept that it's normal for me to forget things, too. Even more frustrating is his constant nitpicking over the small ways I've changed over the years. After spending so much time alone in this house, naturally I've picked up a few new hobbies. My husband can't come to terms with this fact, expressing disbelief in my sudden love of gardening the most. You effing hate the dirt, he snaps at me. You hate the way it feels under your nails. I still do, I reply, trying to keep my composure. Be patient, the doctor always says. That's why I wear gloves, honey. I like the feeling of growing something out of nothing. I get to plant my favorite flowers instead of buying them for the vases like I used to. Sometimes things are good, but most of the time they aren't. It truly is one step forward and two steps back. Sometimes it feels like 20. The doctor says he's likely projecting. He feels so out of control of his own life that he needs to control mine. Be patient, he always says as we end a phone call, and I scream internally each time. My husband wakes up screaming almost every night. Sometimes he lets me comfort him, sometimes he won't. I know this is hard for him. He will often say something like, I don't effing get it. Logically, I know you are my wife. You have her eyes, her smile, her everything. You know everything about her, everything about us. Oh God, what the hell's wrong with me? I know he's broken, but I can fix him. He is fundamentally different now, but I can build a life with this new man once he lets me in. Today is actually going pretty well. We laughed over coffee this morning, and he kissed me on my way out to buy some more bulbs for the empty patch in my garden. I've spent most of the day running errands since I'm not able to get out much lately. I even stopped at the local winery to pick up my husband's favorite red. It will go perfectly with his favorite meal, which I'm planning to cook tonight. I try to guard my feelings these days, but I actually feel good today. That's why my heart sinks when my husband greets me from the kitchen with that god-awful phrase again, "You're not my effing wife." Tears are streaming down his face, and he's holding an old family photo of me in one hand. He's not just angry, he's devastated. I move swiftly to his side, ready to embrace him and give him the speech that is actually starting to convince him that yes, I am his effing wife. Babe, please, you know who I am. No, babe, I don't. You aren't my effing wife, he shouts, completely out of touch and beyond reason. It's at this point that I notice he's also holding his gun, low in his lap, pointed at me. Ryan, listen, I firm my tone, approaching him slowly. You don't know what you're saying. You get confused. You know this. His expression softens, and so does mine. He looks down for a moment. When he returns his gaze to meet mine, his features have contorted into the most deranged and savage look I've ever seen. He aims and shoots. I brace myself, eyes closing instinctively, and hear the bullet speed past me. It burrows deep into the wall. His poor spatial perception, another effect of the head injury, has saved my life. Terrified for my life, my primal survival instincts take over. In his confusion, I rush him with a knife resting on the counter. I plunge it deep into his chest, over and over again. Anger and frustration and disappointment bubble up and magnify my fear response. I already hear the sirens wailing in the distance by the time I'm done. In this neighborhood, police arrive immediately when neighbors report shots fired. The police find me hysterical on the kitchen floor. I know my husband is dead, but the EMTs work on him anyway. After the EMTs clear me, the police take me in for questioning. Luckily, it's a pretty open and shut case of self-defense. They consider his condition. His doctor confirms that I have called countless times about his erratic behavior. They find gunshot residue on my deceased husband's hands. The neighbors confirm they heard him shouting at me before the shot was fired. They called because they feared for my safety, and so they let me go. Back to that empty house again. I feel like a completely changed woman as I enter that house. I make my way back to the kitchen, floor still bloodied by my struggle, and drop onto the ground. And then I laugh, just effing laugh, because of course this would happen to me. My life has been nothing but struggle, fighting to get by, and yeah, killing when I needed to. Nothing has ever gone my way. I've worked myself half to death, but my sister had everything handed to her. None of that ever came my way, of course. She was too much of a stingy bitch to ever think about me. So when she finally reached out to me after all these years, and I found she'd married rich, was sitting pretty in this mansion while I slaved every day away just to afford the measly rent on my barely legal apartment, I just lost it. I thought, why shouldn't I take something for myself? Just this once. I mean, nobody, not even my sister, ever showed me any mercy. It was my turn. Her husband didn't even know about me. I was an embarrassment to her, her failure of a twin sister. I think I just reminded her of what could have been, the miserable life she could have led if things went just slightly different for her. I spent the following months praying that Ryan would die overseas. I analyzed every last picture in the house. I pored over her diaries. She was so self-absorbed, she wrote down everything that happened to her. The bitch made it so easy to assume her identity that I couldn't believe it took me this long to kill her. I guess the sentimental old cow actually kept a picture of the two of us hidden away. That's what Ryan found. What finally sent him over the edge into attempted murder. I almost feel bad for him, but mostly I'm so infuriated that he couldn't just let me have this one thing for once. Why couldn't he just let me be happy? I was trying so effing hard. I took care of him day and night. I spent so much time trying to get to know him, but he couldn't be bothered to put in any effort to do the same for me. Hell, I don't even like men, but I was still willing to give him a chance, instead of just doing him in right away, like I did to dear old sis. Somehow, I still couldn't measure up to my perfect effing sister, even when I was her. I laugh so hard my eyes well up with tears and my stomach aches. I reach into a cabinet and retrieve that damn picture. The picture that broke the illusion. I managed to shove it in there as soon as I was finished with Ryan. I push myself up off the floor and walk weakly over to the stove. I flick the burner on and let that damn photograph burn. I gather the ashes of the last hint of my miserable old life in my hands and walk through the beautiful French-style doors into the sprawling and perfectly effing manicured backyard. I spread the ashes of myself, the self I don't want to be anymore, onto my beloved garden. I smile down at the beautiful bunches of hyacinths bursting up from the fertile ground. It was so kind of me to plant my sister's favorite flowers atop the pieces of her dead body. My wife went back to her country. Someone else came back. My wife got the call at 2 a.m. In the span of a minute, I watched her face change, from confused to concerned to deeply upset. She hung up the phone and sighed, and a little bit of her soul seemed to escape with her breath. My mother died, she said. Her voice was flat, resigned. I put my hand on her shoulder. I'm so sorry, honey, I said. She simply shook her head and slid off the bed. I need to go back to Romania, she said. Just for a week or two. For the funeral and to solve some family matters. My curiosity was piqued, but I didn't dare to ask. My wife has always been very private about her family, and she gets upset when asked too closely about it. I've always tried to respect her space on this. This time was no exception. I simply kissed her on the forehead and lay back in bed, watching the back of her head as she booked next-day airline tickets, silently resigning myself to a week of sitting on the couch, eating Chinese takeout, and watching old office reruns. She flew out the following evening and returned a week and a half later. Only when I picked her up at the airport, it wasn't her. I couldn't explain the dread that filled my body as the woman approached me, smiling. She looked exactly like my wife, but there was some indefinable quality that was not the same. She hugged me, and my body went stiff. She held me at arm's length, beaming joy, but her eyes were cold. Is everything okay, honey? She asked. I nodded. My stomach sunk when I spotted the difference. My wife has a small birthmark on her cheek, a beauty mark, but this woman's cheek was bare. What happened to your birthmark? I asked, as nonchalantly as I could. Oh, the woman said, you noticed. My great aunt gave me something to get rid of it. Some sort of secret recipe that burned like hell. She wouldn't tell me what was in it, but it worked like a charm. She smiled, but her eyes were searching, seeing if I believed her. Beginning to doubt myself, I smiled back. When we got home, I went straight for a beer to settle my nerves. I saw a bowl of strawberries, and it gave me an idea. "Hey, honey," I called out, "we've got some strawberries left over. Want some?" "Sure," she said, walking into the kitchen. I handed her the bowl. As she bit the end off the strawberry, she winked at me. Chills ran down my spine. My wife was deathly allergic to strawberries. The only reason they were in the house at all was that I had forgotten to throw them out before I picked her up at the airport. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Her eyes roved up and down my face. "Fine," I said, forcing a smile. "I just missed you, is all." "Aw," she said, and planted a kiss on my forehead. I didn't know what to do. Luckily, my phone rang just then, and I used that as an out. "I'm expecting a call from work," I lied, ducking into the other room to take the call. "Honey?" said the voice on the other end. I recognized it immediately as the voice of my wife. "Hey," I said breathlessly, "you won't believe what's going on." "I know what's going on," said my wife. "Just listen. You need to get out of the house." "Okay," I said, "I will." I hung up the phone. When I turned around, my fake wife was standing in the doorway staring at me. "Is everything okay, honey?" she asked. My heart was pounding in my throat as I answered. "It's fine," I lied. "Work emergency, I've got to go." "Okay, honey," she said. "Well, hurry back." She winked and licked her lips, but her eyes looked so cold and filled with something that looked like hunger. I quickly got out of there. On my way out of the driveway, my phone rang once again. "Did you get out of the house?" my wife asked as soon as I picked up the phone. "Yes," I said. "I did. Can you please tell me what is going on now?" "I will in time," said my wife. "Just don't go back to the house until I call you and tell you it's okay. Check into a hotel." Before I could protest, the line clicked dead. When I tried to call back, I got a notice that the line had been disconnected. I called in sick for work, and I slept in the hotel for 3 days before I got the phone call from my wife. "It's safe," she said. "You can come home now." She hung up before I answered. When I got there, my wife was waiting for me in the doorway. As soon as I saw her, my heart flooded with joy. I jumped out of the car and ran to embrace her. I held her face in my hands and examined it, just to be sure. It was my wife, all right. The birthmark was there and everything. After that, I let her bury her face in my chest. We stood there hugging for an eternity that was far too short before she broke away. "Come on inside," she said. "I'll make you a drink and explain everything." My wife mixed my whiskey and Coke strong, just how I liked, and I downed it greedily as she sat down across from me. As I was setting the glass back down, I noticed a smudge on my shirt. It was greasy, like one of my wife's makeup pens. 3 realizations hit me at once. The drink tasted funny, the room was spinning, and my wife's birthmark had rubbed off.